man and a woman. More systematically, property seizure has been used as a means to control religious practice. Since the 1975 communist takeover of South Vietnam, the Vietnamese government has seized many religious institutions and effectively banned their existence. A prime example is the complete property seizure of the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam in 1981, leading to its dissolution. The Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam has since been outlawed, and its religious leaders have been constantly harassed. Other religious sects such as the Hoa Hao Buddhists and the Con Dau have suffered a similar fate. Almost as a rule, all land disputes against the Catholic Church in Vietnam result in violence. A great number of Catholic institutions in North Vietnam were seized in the 1950s. The same has happened in the South since the communists took over in 1975. Parishioners of Tai Ha Church in Hanoi were beaten by police and government thugs while attending a prayer vigil for the return of the church properties. Those government henchmen proceeded to desecrate and destroy religious symbols and properties. Anyone perceived to be a protest leader was arrested. This pattern of abuse has been repeated the last few years as at many other parishes, including Loan Lý, Bầu Sen, Tam Tòa, Dom Chiem, and the St. Paul of Charles Monastery in the Diocese of Vĩnh Long. As we'll hear more about today, the government of Da Nang City recently ordered the people of Con Dau, a town of about 2,000 Catholics, to vacate their homes, farmlands, and their historic cemetery to make way for a high-end resort to be built by a joint venture with private companies. When the people of Con Dau resisted the order, violence broke out at a funeral procession for a member of the parish. The police seized the casket and cremated the body of the deceased against her last wish. Many members of the funeral procession were beaten and arrested, and now some are facing trial. Others have fled the country and are seeking asylum. Mr. Nguyen, a member of the funeral procession, was interrogated numerous times and died after severe beating. I want to thank the witnesses who will testify here today. Many of you have close relatives in Con Dau who have suffered grave injustices. Thank you for speaking out for them. I look forward to hearing your testimony. And for those of you who are not testifying today, I ask the chairman to allow their written testimony to be submitted for the record. Finally, let me say that I wholeheartedly endorse House Resolution 1572's call for the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, and the UN Special Rapporteur on religious freedom or belief to inquire, investigate, and report on the situation throughout Vietnam and specifically in Con Dau, including the discrimination, police impunity, mistreatment in detention, desecration of religious and historical properties, and the beating death of Vietnam. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Gall. The statement will be open for the record to submit your statement. Congressman Smith.
Thank you very much, Chairman Wolf, and I want to thank you especially for convening and chairing this very important hearing, and special thanks to Ein Joseph Cao for suggesting that the Lantos Commission meet in an emergency session to voice our collective concern for the brutal murders and systematic mistreatment of Catholics at Con Dau. Thank you also to our very distinguished witnesses for participating today, and I do look forward to hearing your testimony. This past Sunday, August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, marked the 80th anniversary of the founding of Con Dau, a Catholic village in the Diocese of Da Nang, Central Vietnam. What should have been a joyous occasion has been marred by unspeakable violence. A few months ago, during a religious funeral procession, Vietnamese officials and riot police disrupted that sad and solemn occasion, shooting tear gas and rubber bullets into the crowd, beating mourners with batons and electric rods. More than 100 people were injured, dozens were arrested, and several remain in custody and have been reportedly severely beaten and tortured by Vietnamese officials. At least 2 innocent people, perhaps more, have been murdered by the Vietnamese police, including Nguyen. His brother Tai is among our distinguished witnesses today, and we welcome him and we offer offer him our condolences for the loss of his son, of his brother, I should say. It is really unspeakable what they have done to him. And I read the detailed account of what they had done to him, and it is, like I said, it's unspeakable. Extraordinary violence committed by a regime that is out of control. The Vietnamese government justifies this violence, torture, and murder because the villagers of Con Dau had previously been ordered, some through coercion, to leave their village, property, church, century-old cemetery, their religious heritage, and to forego equitable compensation in order to make way for a new green resort. Nothing, however, not even governmental orders, grant license for government-sanctioned murder and other human rights abuses. As we will hear shortly from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, this is unfortunately not an isolated incident. In fact, according to the 2010 annual report, quote, property disputes between the government and the Catholic Church continue to lead to harassment, property destruction, and violence, sometimes by contract thugs hired by the government to break up peaceful prayer vigils. In recent years, the Vietnamese government has stepped up its persecution of Catholic believers, bulldozing churches. Matter of fact, Mr. Wolf and I, the last time we heard of bulldozing Catholic churches and churches that happen to be Orthodox was in Romania, under the infamous reign of Nicholas Ceausescu, a brutal dictator who actually bulldozed churches, sometimes with the people still in it. The Vietnamese government continues to dismantle crucifixes, and it wreaks havoc on peaceful prayer vigils. Persecution of religious followers, however, is not limited to the Catholic Church in Vietnam. In fact, I have in my hand right here a list of nearly 300 Montagnard political and religious prisoners, men and women who over the last decade have protested the denial of their religious freedom and have been driven off their land. The persecution of the Montagnard, like Catholics, is ongoing. In January of this year, the government of Vietnam sentenced 2 Montagnard Christians to 9 and 12 years of imprisonment, respectively, for organizing a so-called, and get this, reactionary underground network. That is how the Vietnamese government refers to a house church. These cruel sentences followed the arrest of dozens of Montagnard members of house churches who refused to join government-controlled churches. The arrests were accompanied by beatings and torture by electroshock devices. We must not forget the sufferings of the Khmer Krom Buddhists, Cao Dai and Po Hoa, Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, and many others. The sad reality is that the Vietnamese government persecutes any religious group that does not submit to government control. While I am eager to listen to the testimony of the witnesses who are here, I, like my colleagues, especially Chairman Wolf, am deeply disappointed that the U.S. Department of State declined the invitation to testify. It was just a few weeks ago that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton met with officials in Hanoi and expressed concern over Vietnam's track record on human rights and abuses of religious freedom. We call on, and I strongly call on the President and the Secretary of State to reimpose country of particular concern, a designation that Mr. Wolf and his historic legislation, the International Religious Freedom Act, designates a country where there is ongoing and pervasive violations of religious liberties and the persecution of believers. Vietnam fits that definition like a glove. I also call on the Secretary to postpone indefinitely taking U.S.-Vietnam relations to the, quote, next level until the government of Vietnam can prove that they too are concerned. And we're talking about deeds, not promises. We want to see real deeds, tangible deeds, before any kind of loosening and expansion of our relationship with Vietnam. Mr. Wolf and I, and Nguyen, had he been here at the time, would have joined. We called on our government to link human rights issues with trade issues. The previous administration, and this one as well, has refused to do so, and now we are reaping, sadly, a terrible, terrible abuse record because of that delinking that occurred last administration, the Bush administration, as well as the Clinton administration, and now the Obama administration. I respectfully ask Commissioner Vandermeer, on behalf of the International Religious Freedom Commission, to visit Vietnam and report back to this commission and to the Congress on the situation of the Con Dau and the violence and harassment faced by Catholic villagers throughout the country. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to a resolution that Mr. Gao, Mr. Wolf, several of my colleagues, and I have introduced on July 29th to condemn and deplore the violence, threats, fines, murder, and harassment in Con Dau. Our legislation, H.Res. 1572, calls for the appointment of a United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Vietnam to investigate the ongoing and serious human rights violations in Vietnam. Urges the government of Vietnam to permit the UN Special Rapporteur on torture and UN Special Rapporteur on religious freedom as well to investigate the events surrounding Con Dau and other similar situations in Vietnam. In addition, our bill calls on the U.S. Embassy to visit Con Dau residents still in prison. And we have a witness today whose sister and brother are still detained, if I'm not correct, to visit those individuals. Have we done it? I don't think so. If we have, we need to step up that effort. And also to continually raise the issue with Vietnamese authorities. And the resolution also urges the State Department to look at property disputes, not as property disputes, but as a thinly veiled attempt to crush and to persecute religious believers. In closing, I would like to mention the plight of Vietnamese refugees and asylum seekers flooding in the surrounding nations. In fact, many from Con Dau have fled to Thailand, seeking relief from the persecution they face in their village. We have a witness who will speak to that as well. And several hundred Khmer Krom asylum seekers are living in Thailand as well, awaiting resettlement. Mr. Chairman, again, this is a very timely hearing, and as Congress comes back into session in just a couple of weeks, not only should this resolution be on the floor, but members of both sides of the aisle, both houses of Congress, and especially the executive branch, have to speak from the rooftops about the outrages that have occurred, are occurring, and unless remedial action is taken, will continue to occur into the future. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chris. Now it's my pleasure to introduce very briefly the witnesses, and it will go in order. First will be Ted Vandermeed. Ted worked up here on Capitol Hill for 23 years and was counsel to Speaker Dennis Hastert. Next will be Simon Nguyen, was the brother of a man who was involved in the beating and the killing by the Vietnam police. Next, Nguyen, brother of Nguyen, who escaped to Thailand. And lastly, the sister of Lim and Min, Nguyen, your brother and sister are still in prison, correct?
Yes.
And lastly, T. Kumar, who's appeared and has been a great champion on human rights and religious freedom with Amnesty International. But that will go in that order, and then we'll all finish and then have questions. Okay?
Mr. Chairman, members of Congress, thank you for this opportunity to testify before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. With the Chairman's approval, I would like to submit my testimony for the record along with the chapter on Vietnam from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's 2010 annual report. The Commission is commonly referred to as USERF. The topic we are considering here today is timely. As you know, Secretary Clinton recently visited Vietnam, where she publicly criticized the Vietnamese government for its attacks on religious communities and said that our two countries have profound differences regarding protection of human rights. USERF commends the Secretary's public statements and urges her to back up these words with concrete actions, including designating Vietnam as a country of particular concern for its systematic, ongoing, egregious violations of religious freedom. In addition, the State Department should support new programs to advance internet freedom and civil society development in Vietnam and work with Congress to help pass the Vietnam Human Rights Act. USERF has testified numerous times before this commission and traveled multiple times to Vietnam since 2003, the last trip being in May 2009. Sadly, we cannot conclude that religious freedom conditions have improved markedly in recent years. Vietnam continues to backslide on human rights, and there remain too many religious freedom violations. Too many individuals detained for independent religious activity or peaceful religious freedom advocacy. Too many cases of discrimination and forced renunciations of faith targeting new converts to Protestantism, or too many stories of government-approved violence targeting Buddhists and Catholics. These abuses occur despite the protections found in Vietnam's constitution and despite Vietnam's international obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.